Today, at the National Press Club of Australia, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivers his first post-budget address. As global economic headwinds build, the Albanese government wants to deliver its mandate against rising inflation. Jim Chalmers with today's Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club's Westpac address, coming to you today from the Great Hall in Parliament House. My name is Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president. Jim Chalmers has attended many of these post-budget press club lunches over the years as a staffer to ministers and treasurers and as an MP. Today he attends as the man of the moment, the Federal Treasurer, to talk about the forecasts and strategy he outlined last night in his first budget. There is an onslaught of questions from journalists awaiting him at the end of the address, and I know that they'll all be very disciplined in asking them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to speak to us today.
Not sure I've heard it described as an onslaught before, but thank you, Laura, for the very kind introduction. Thank you to yourself, to the board, to Morris, for having me back at the National Press Club to speak for what is the sixth time, but as Laura says, the first time as Treasurer. And carrying on what is a really important tradition of fronting up the day after the budget to give you a broader sense of the perspective behind and beyond the numbers that we released last night. I want to acknowledge the elders and customs and traditions of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people and reiterate how proud we are of our government's commitment to a voice to Parliament. And I'm really proud, thank you. And I'm really proud of the budget that we handed down last night. I'm grateful to my colleagues. More than 30 colleagues are here today, I'm told. I appreciate them making the time. I want to single out, in particular, the Economic Team and the Expenditure Review Committee, and key to all of that, of course, Katie Gallagher, the Finance Minister, who's played such an influential role in the putting together of this budget. Please put your hands together for Katie. And also, of course, to the Prime Minister, who's joined us today, and I appreciate the support that he's given all of us as we've put the finishing touches on the budget. Please put your hands together for Anthony. There are a number of public servants in the room. I see Glyn, I see Stephen Kennedy, and a number of other public servants here, and I reiterate what I told them last night, what I told them last week, what we talked about in the Cabinet, is that we appreciate all of the hard work that goes in, often around the clock, to finish something as big as this, such a monumental undertaking. And so I convey once again my thanks to everyone who's been a part of this budget. I wanted to thank you as well for welcoming Laura here to lunch today, or as Morris refers to her, Laura from the Tizer, back in her old stomping ground in the Canberra Press Gallery. We didn't bring the kids this time. We figure that given two of them sat still for 30 minutes last night, it would be pushing it to expect them to sit still for another 60 minutes today. And so we're here sans kids. Here as well with colleagues from my office who I can see, and for all of the staffing ranks, I thank everybody for making the time. The task and the test of any budget is to understand and respond to simultaneously the challenges around the world and around the kitchen table. And I think in this budget that is the case more than ever. And much of what we presented last night was motivated by the extreme cost of living pressures faced by Australians around the country, brought about by the lingering impacts of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and by natural disasters as well here at home, which puts pressure on supply chains and obviously puts upward pressure on prices as well. Now, budgets at their best bring together the global and the local, and on this occasion there is almost no distinction between the two things. So I wanted to begin with a bit of a confession. I was in two minds about heading to DC less than a fortnight from the budget. But I'm pleased that I went because I benefited so much, I think, from the opportunity to spend 2.5 very long but very valuable days there talking with my G20 counterparts and the heads of central banks, the IMF, the World Bank, and some of the world's biggest investment houses. Now, the big lesson was that you have to get the monetary policy and the fiscal policy working together and not at cross purposes. And I'm confident in that regard that we got things lined up pretty nicely last night. But of all of the value that I got from that trip, I think one contribution stands out in particular from a guy called Tharman Shanmugaratnam. He is a Singaporean minister. He's a long-standing friend of Australia and many people in the room here. And he made three main points that I wanted to share with you because I think his prognosis fits our circumstances pretty well, and it's a pretty pithy way of describing them, in my view. And his diagnosis was basically this. First, the world is increasingly marked by fragility and vulnerability in our communities, our economies, our budgets, our energy markets, our international relationships, and our politics as well. That's the first point. Second point, these vulnerabilities have all been made worse in one way or another by underinvestment and complacency over a number of years, and not just because of the pandemic. And this is what I refer to in our context as the wasted decade that we've had here. And his third point is that our task should go beyond managing what the economists call counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Instead, it's to redirect spending towards quality investments in the capabilities of our people and the capacity of our economies. So I think that's a pretty neat summary of the three things that really underpinned our thinking as we finalised yesterday's budget. Now, I invite you again to consider the historical context of this budget this way. There are a number of you, I'm conscious, that have done more budget lockups than I have. I know that. But yesterday was my 16th budget lockup. And while I haven't done a hard count, I think this is probably more than anybody else in the current parliament. And in that time, we've had two serious global downturns, and now we confront the prospect of a third, all in the space of just a decade and a half. The first was a financial crisis that became a demand shock. The second was a health crisis that became largely a supply shock. And those crises and their responses had different elements, but both involved a substantial fiscal and monetary response. Now, this time is different, and it warrants a different response as well. Inflation is back at a level we haven't seen since I was in primary school. We were reminded of that an hour or so ago with new CPI numbers showing we hit 7.3% through the year to the September quarter. And we expect inflation to peak later this year and stay higher for longer, mainly due to energy prices and natural disasters before they start to moderate. Now, the rising costs of energy come courtesy of the war in Europe, but a decade of energy policy chaos hasn't helped either. And that's why energy prices are a bigger reason why inflation is higher than we'd like for longer than we'd like. Now, it's already well understood that Australia enjoyed nearly 3 decades of uninterrupted economic growth until that ended in 2020. But it should also be understood that low and stable inflation was a cornerstone of that remarkable run. And now we are in genuinely different and genuinely difficult times. A period of multiplying economic uncertainties. War in Europe, inflation in the US, a slowdown in China, with significant braking forces operating on our economy internationally and domestically in the form of tighter monetary policy. So the global downturn that is now in prospect could be described as an energy shock combining with the after effects of the pandemic, which has brought about blunt and brutal interest rate rises globally, more synchronised than anything we've seen in the decades-long inflation targeting era. And that has implications: the substantial hit to growth, the potential for a hard landing, the possibility of a global recession. And today I want to explain how these factors and these forces have shaped our thinking as we pulled together this budget in 3 areas. how they shaped our approach to cost of living relief, how they shaped our approach to strengthening the economy, and how they shaped our approach to budget repair as well. So first, to cost of living relief. There's never any shortage of worthy and well-meaning offers or ideas on where we might spend more money. And that temptation becomes a lot stronger when you see people hurting. As a Labor government, as Labor people, we feel that. We care about that. It keeps us awake. We see what rising prices means for families, taking more from hip pockets and pushing people closer to the edge. And whether it's food, whether it's electricity, whether it's rent, inflation is public enemy number one. Inflation is the dragon we need to slay. And in the weeks leading up to yesterday, cost of living relief was the subject of most of the questions I got from yourselves and from your colleagues, and that's not surprising, because it's the source of most concern in our communities right now, which is why it was the centrepiece in lots of ways of our budget last night. But there's a right way to spend and there's a wrong way to spend. And perhaps surprising to some was our determination to deliver cost of living relief only where it met very specific and very strict criteria. Relief that was targeted in the right way, timed in the right way, and which delivered the right kind of result. And we did it in this way not to appear tough, not just to win kudos with the econocrats or the markets or the commentariat, but because we knew that doing any different would be doing damage to the people that we are here to serve. An indiscriminate spraying of cash would have made our inflation challenge more profound and more prolonged, and ultimately more painful for people who would have felt it through higher prices and higher interest rates as well. And I think most people get that. And my sense in recent months is that there is a pretty solid understanding in our communities of how all this works, the balancing act, the tightrope that we're trying to walk here. At a time of rapidly rising interest rates, we weren't prepared to do something that might have made a nice splash on budget day, but would ultimately be counterproductive to tackling the inflation challenge. So that meant any cost of living measure couldn't be inflationary. It had to deliver at least another purpose, pull at least another lever in the economy. Whether on the supply side or through productivity or through participation, it had to deliver some kind of economic dividend. And you see that in the plan that we set out last night. Cheaper childcare because it helps more people, especially women, back into work. The same goes for paid parental leave, good for participation, good for productivity. Cheaper medicines is a pretty simple example of investment that recognises healthier people and more productive people too. Our agenda for housing affordability and the new accord at the centre of it, increasing supply in a sector of the economy that desperately needs it. Helping people live closer to where they work, but taking the time to do it right and not at a time when the supply chains in the construction sector are already crunched. And our agenda to get wages moving again in strong but also broad and sustainable ways. So if the centrality of inflation drove our response to cost of living relief and wages policy, it also drove the second part of our focus in the budget, investing in a stronger and more resilient economy. The age of stagnant wages didn't just happen on its own. It was no unhappy accident. You can draw a line through the last 10 years or so and you can find all of the points of friction. Now, giving the game away on clean energy, surrendering an entire industry and its manufacturing capability, undermining penalty rates and job security, letting our skills base crumble and collapse. And through all of that, you can see why. In an unfamiliar fit of honesty, the Liberals said that stagnant wages were a deliberate design feature of the economy on their watch. And when you tally it all up, yeah, it looked pretty deliberate. This low skill, low productivity, low wage reality is the result of a lack of investment and a lack of interest in the key drivers of sustainable growth stretched out across a decade. And we pay the cost of that now because it's made our economy more susceptible more vulnerable to the kinds of global shocks that we're going through now, and our people are more exposed to its effects as a consequence. Now, if our vulnerability to these shocks has been exacerbated by underinvestment in the potential of our people and our economy, it stands to reason that investing in these areas builds our strength and resilience against future shocks. And that's the approach that we took last night, towards quality investments in the capabilities of our people and the capacity of our economy, making sure more people can get a trade or other vocational training because the jobs are there and more are coming, but the skills workers aren't. Getting our energy market firmed up and driving investment in cleaner and cheaper and more reliable forms of power. It's about finding a place for modern manufacturing in our country and adding value to global supply chains instead of just waiting at the end of them. Building on the things we know are good for a modern economy, like a better NBN. And I think really, above all else, greater equality, greater recognition and greater participation for women. Understanding not just the moral imperative of gender equality, but the economic potential that comes with it. So if this budget's approach to the economy is about resilience, then our approach to the budget position is about restraint. And that's important for the particular position the budget is in and for the inflation challenge which drove the deliberations of the ERC and the decisions taken by our Cabinet. And we've got two things happening here. The first, much higher levels of employment and much higher prices for commodities than initially assumed, delivering substantial revenue improvements over the next couple of years. The second is 5 big pressures on the spending side of the ledger, which you're all very familiar with by now: health, aged care, NDIS, defence, and the fastest growing, which is the cost of servicing the debt at higher interest rates. Now, many of the factors contributing to increases in revenue since the pre-election outlook are temporary. They are forecast to fade and fall, as you saw in the budget papers. But the factors contributing to spending growth are expected to get bigger every year, constant and compounding pressures on the budget. Now, knowing that, it would be reckless to spend all of the revenue windfall right now for 3 reasons. Because it would almost certainly add to inflation, because even with it, the budget is still deep in the red, and because we don't expect it to last. Instead, we're returning almost all of that revenue to the budget. And that means that over the next 2 years, when inflation is at its most acute in the forecasts, new spending is substantially offset and real growth in payments is actually negative. And that's the responsible budget management that these times call for. And it recognises that the budget remains in persistent structural deficit, substantially weighed down by those 5 big and growing spending pressures that we've discussed. 1, the unavoidable cost of the debt, and the other 4, fundamental policy priorities. Now, these 4 spends are generally classified as structural pressures, but they are more than that, of course. Keeping our nation safe, empowering people with a disability, guaranteeing Australians access to good and affordable healthcare, restoring quality and dignity and humanity and security to aged care as well. Now, these aren't just structural costs. They are vital investments. They are fundamental to our values, to our people's quality of life as well. And they speak to who we are, people who look out for each other and look after each other. So, returning tax receipt upgrades to the budget is about dealing with inflation, it's about making room for fundamental priorities down the track, and it's also, in historical terms, pretty unusual. And I want to dwell for a moment on this because it is central, in my view, to why last night's budget wasn't just responsible by recent standards, but responsible by the standards of a much longer historical sweep. In absolute terms, what we saw yesterday was the biggest ever instance of returning tax upgrades to the budget. $124 billion extra brought in over the forward estimates, excluding GST, and $114 billion of that returned to the budget. And if you cast back and look at every budget and every budget update for the past 25 years, since the Howard and Costello budgets, there have been 33 occasions when tax receipts have been upgraded. On average, across these revisions over the past quarter century, about 60% has been spent and about 40% has been returned to the bottom line. Last night, we returned more than 90% of the upgrade to the budget. 99% of the upward revisions for the next 2 years and 92% of the upward revisions over the forward estimates. Now, this compares to the Howard-Costello average of around 30%, to the Abbott-Hockey, Turnbull-Morrison, Morrison-Frydenberg average of around 40%. And it's a bit better even than the Rudd-Gillard-Swan average of around 80%. So our decision not to spend all of the upwards revision in tax receipts saves the budget $47 billion in interest payments over the forward estimates and into the medium term, helping us deliver a lower debt position over the forward estimates compared to what was in the March budget, with gross debt at the end of the decade lower by over 4% of GDP than if that money had been spent like our predecessors did. There have been 14 occasions over the past 25 years where 100% of a tax upgrade was spent and not a cent returned to the budget in that year, and they've all been under Liberal national governments. 12 under Howard and Costello and 2 under Morrison and Frydenberg. So we had a choice to make: return the windfall to the budget or spend it at a time of high inflation with a worsening outlook in later years. And we chose spending restraint. It would have been easier, frankly, to spend these upgrades, but it wouldn't have been the right fiscal strategy. Not when the number one defence we have in the face of global uncertainty is a responsible budget here at home. And so that's what our budget is. Responsible, not reckless, restraint on the fiscal side and resilience on the economic side. Right for the times and ready for the future. Now, if I can very briefly take you back again, not quite 25 years, but just 5 months to election night 2022, when the Prime Minister-elect addressed the nation for the first time. I think Anthony changed the tone that night. And when he changed the tone of our national politics, that helped us change the substance as well, of how a government ought to behave, of how a cabinet ought to operate, how we discuss issues, how we deliberate, and how we come to decisions. I think we kept faith with that last night on budget night. Now, one of the nice things I hear a fair bit about Anthony's government is that people feel like the adults are back in charge, and it's nice to hear. It's how we intend to continue. I think it says something about how seriously we take our responsibilities. But I also think it says something about how people seeing us talk about the economy, the budget and its challenges in a fairly open and honest way. Now, last night I spoke briefly of the Australian character that does reveal itself in times of crisis, like natural disasters that we're seeing now. We see it in the worst of times. We see it in the best of the humanity that finds a way in Australia to break through, whether it's filling up sandbags, rebuilding roads or serving meals or going house to house to check in on neighbours and strangers alike. That's who we are. It's part of our character. And part of that character is us levelling with each other about whatever adversity we face so that we can face it together and work it out and get on with it. Whether in politics or in life more generally, I think people appreciate being brought in, not talked down to or talked past. And that's been a practice more breached than honoured in our recent politics. From my perspective, it's probably one of the things that has most unmoored public life from public esteem. Now, since taking on this job, I've tried to have a serious go at being as upfront as I can be about what's happening in the economy and what it means for the budget. Now, sometimes I don't get it bang on. It can be inelegant, it can be ineloquent, but I always try and preference the blunt over the polished. And I want to take people into our confidence about what we're seeing, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. As I said last night, and as I've said before, this is just the beginning of the conversation I want us to have about the longer-term position of the budget, about the things we've got going for us and the things we need to confront, about our priorities as a country and the choices we need to make to honour and pay for them. Now, this springs from an optimistic, realistic mindset, not a pessimistic one, because for all that's confronting and challenging about this period, we aren't daunted and we aren't distracted. We are driven by our determination to transform this moment of adversity into an age of long-term prosperity for our people. We are energised by this opportunity. We are determined to do something with it in the time that we've got, to steer our country through these choppy waters and towards a better future, a future worthy of the Australian people that we are so privileged to serve. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Treasurer. I suppose one of the interesting things about budget nights is that everybody sort of basically says, oh yes, well they've delivered their election commitments, we'll just pocket those and move on to the next subject. And that's obviously, as you've mentioned, to talk about structural change in the budget in the period ahead, and you've just talked about moments of adversity. Do you think that the fact that things are so grim actually both accelerates and increases the opportunity to produce, very big changes in the budget? You've signalled it has to happen on both sides, on spending and tax. Is spending reform more important than tax reform? And do you think the tax system is equal enough? Should there be more equality in the tax system?
Well, thanks, Laura. I'll take that in two parts. First of all, when it comes to our election commitments, one of the heartening things about being able to deliver on the commitments that we took to the last election in areas like early childhood education and in some of the other commitments that we made is that if you sat down in the current climate with a blank sheet of paper and wrote the main things that you should do in the environment in which we find ourselves, you would do the things that we had committed to, whether it's, we've got these skills and labour shortages, childcare is a big part of that, fee-free TAFE's a big part of dealing with that, as well as migration. So a lot of the commitments that we honoured last night were, even absent the fact that we had taken them to election, the right kind of things for the economic conditions that we confront. Now, obviously, we showed yesterday that when it comes to putting the budget on a more sustainable footing, you need a combination of all of the things you identified. You need to trim spending, and we did that by $22 billion yesterday. I pay tribute to Katie and her work, but collectively as well. We can't find a single saving on the expenditure side in the March budget, and we came up with $22 billion worth of savings yesterday. So that's a big part of the story. Spending restraint, for all of the reasons I ran through in my speech, absolutely crucial. The easiest thing in the world is to get a temporary boost to revenue and turn it into a permanent spending commitment. That's been happening since Howard and Costello. We were determined to avoid that. And tax reform has a role to play as well. And we've said for some time that the best place to begin is multinational tax reform, and that was in the budget yesterday. We also extended some of the compliance programs, which have been very effective, and we need to continue to be effective so that people are paying the tax that they're supposed to be paying. And I think we've been pretty upfront about that in saying, well, that's how we've demonstrated that budgets can be about restraint and trimming spending and sensible tax reform. And whether there's 2 more budgets in the life of this parliament or 3 more budgets in the life of this parliament, I think people should expect the same kind of combination in the budgets that we're yet to hand down as we saw in the budget yesterday.
Phil Curry has a question.
Thanks, Laura. Treasurer Phil Curry from the AFR. About 6 months ago we were standing here and your predecessor was up on the podium talking about their own plan for the recovery, and a very heavy emphasis, or a very large part of that plan involved the private sector. They talked about a business-led recovery, time for the government to pull back and let business, generate the growth, the job creation. So it was a kind of language that was notably absent from your budget last night, and there's, tomorrow you're about to unveil an industrial relations bill, which has got a few people in this room nervous. I was just wondering what, if any, is Labor's planned role for the business sector, for the private sector, in confronting the challenges ahead?
Absolutely crucial. And I know that my predecessor talked about that a lot, but what we did in the budget yesterday is we put our money where our mouth is when it comes to working with the business community. You think about the housing accord that Julie Collins and I worked on and released yesterday with a bit of help from the Herald. And what that was all about was recognising that when you've got big challenges in the economy, government typically can't solve them on their own. Often the market can't solve it on its own, and so you work out what are your big advantages. And our advantages in this country, enlightened business community, wanting to do the right thing, big superannuation, trillions of dollars of superannuation funds, and in this case, a building and construction sector led by the peak industry groups who want to do the right thing as well. So I see business as absolutely central, absolutely crucial to everything that we're trying to achieve. The last time we were here in these numbers, we brought together business people and unions from all around Australia in the Jobs and Skills Summit that Anthony and I hosted here in this room. And I think that was a demonstration, as was the budget, as was the relationship that I have with people like Jennifer Westacott and others who I respect greatly, immensely, and spend a lot of time with and have a lot of time for. Business will be crucial to our prospects going forward, and I think what we've done in the budget around the housing accord and in other areas shows that we don't just say that, we mean that.
Claire Armstrong.
Thanks, Treasurer. Claire Armstrong from News Corp Australia. A 56% rise in power prices is going to force many Australians to avoid turning on their heater this coming winter. In extreme cases, this can lead to loss of life if someone has a chronic illness and they avoid doing something like this. There's also already warnings that small businesses and manufacturers may go under as a result of these price increases. So if the $275 that Labor promised at the election isn't coming, what can the government do right now to ensure that people can turn the lights on and that businesses won't go under?
Yeah. That modelling that you refer to was done in 2021 and it referred to an outcome in 2025. And in the interim, we've got a war in Europe, which is creating absolute havoc in energy markets around the world and pushing up electricity prices here at home. It remains the case that renewable energy is cheaper energy. We see what's happening in global energy markets is a reason to do more, to get more renewables into the system. Our opponents see it as an excuse to do less. So that's our starting point. What we saw in the inflation number today was, unfortunately, the front end of some of these pressures on electricity prices that you're right to refer to. A bigger and bigger part of our inflation challenge will be a combination of higher electricity prices and the impacts of natural disasters on grocery prices as well. And that number that we got today is 7.3%. A substantial part of that is electricity, and we understand that. And we know that that makes life harder for Australians who are already under the pump for lots of reasons. We still expect our inflation to peak around the same level towards the end of the year, but petrol's come off a bit quicker and electricity prices and groceries are going to be a bigger and bigger part of that. In terms of what we do about it, obviously there's already been a number of steps taken. I pay tribute to Chris Bowen in this regard, bringing energy ministers together, because so much of what needs to be done here happens at the state level. He's brought energy ministers together. He's made some progress in the budget. We did more for our regulators in important ways. But as I flagged yesterday, and as I'm happy to repeat today, I do think there's more work to be done on the regulatory side. And I've been deliberate in not preempting the specifics of that because it involves a heap of colleagues and it involves governments at multiple levels. But if there is something that we can sensibly do on energy beyond the substantial steps that we've already taken, if we can do that to help take some of the sting out of these price rises, then obviously we'll consider it.
Mark Riley.
Mark Riley from the Seven Network Treasury. Just further to Claire's question and what you've said, would a price trigger be one of those sensible solutions to the problem? has the inflation figure today made redundant the main assumptions in the budget on prices? And if the 50% increase in electricity does eventuate in the 40% increase in gas, will you consider some form of energy rebate or energy supplement in your next budget, particularly for low-income people, pensioners and welfare recipients?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. So in terms of our forecast for inflation, we don't expect that to change markedly. What we saw today with inflation was broadly in line with what the Treasury was expecting. The market was expecting about 7, it came in at 7.3, so at the higher end of market expectations, but not dramatically so. The upside risk to inflation and to that peak, and some of the things that the Reserve Bank and others will be contemplating, will be whether or not the natural disasters play a bigger role in that peak, the timing of that peak towards the end of the year. And so, clearly in volatile times, forecasting is a difficult business to be involved in, but what we saw today doesn't substantially change our expectations, but the combination of electricity and natural disasters has the capacity to be a little worse than what we anticipated last night. In terms of the challenge in energy, part of it is gas, part of it is as it feeds into energy more broadly. And we've said on the gas front that we need to build on the good work that Madeleine King did in terms of getting more supply into the market, and we need to now consider things like the Code of Conduct, like price in the gas market. High gas prices are absolutely smashing our local industry, and they're making life that much harder, as Dan Walton and others have identified today. So we've got more work to do there. We've said that that's the case, again, working collaboratively with my colleagues. In terms of the type of mechanism, triggers, caps, other kinds of regulation, I'm not prepared to preempt any of that or narrow down the conversation today. It does involve multiple levels of government, it does involve multiple ministers, and so I'd rather leave our options pretty open. And the same goes for, in some future budget, if there is a genuine case to provide support to people differently than what we did last night with our $7.5 billion cost of living relief package, if there's a compelling case to do that at some future point, obviously we'd consider it.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Dr Chalmers, I think you said you're not keen on an inquiry to look at the tax system, maybe because you've been through such an inquiry. But nevertheless, Michael Keating, a former distinguished public servant and one-time head of finance, has suggested that there should be an inquiry, firstly, into what revenue we need, and secondly, when we establish that, into the ways that such revenue could be raised. It does seem a very logical way to go about things. What do you think of that sort of proposal?
Yeah, I've got a lot of time for Mike. I spend some time with him. We correspond from time to time. He's one of those people who've been around this town for a long time that I consult regularly, whether it's Mike Keating, Martin Parkinson, Ken Henry from time to time. And I think I've made it pretty clear, and I've been pretty blunt about it, that I think we do need to consider the tax system when we think about long-term, sustainable budget repair. And as I said in response to Laura's first question, I think we'd be unnecessarily narrowing the conversation if we said, okay, we've got this massive structural problem in the budget. It comes from intensifying spending pressures. It comes from the rapidly increasing cost of servicing the $1 trillion of debt that we inherited. I think it would be unwise to limit our options to just one area of budget repair. And what Katie and I were able to show yesterday, I think, with the help of the ERC and the Cabinet colleagues more broadly, is that you can combine all of these things: spending restraint, trimming spending, sensible tax reform, and also making sure that any new investments that you're making deliver some economic bang for buck. And so I don't want to limit the conversation. You're right to assume, partly for historical reasons, that I don't immediately rush for another tax review. Other colleagues might have a view about that as well. But I think we broadly know what the challenges are. Certainly in the budget position, we broadly know what the levers are. And last night we began to utilise those levers, but there'll be more to come.
Patrick Commons.
Thanks, Treasurer. Patrick Commons from the Australian newspaper. You talk about sensible tax reform, and you've also spoken about having a conversation with the Australian people about some of these decisions that need to be made. So will you be coming to the Australian people in the coming months before the next budget, trying to develop a tax reform package that you can present to Australians at the next budget? Are you open to everything? Will it revisit some of your previous proposals, perhaps around capital gains tax, all of those things?
Well, first of all, I mean, we take seriously the positions that we took to the election around capital gains and some of those other proposals. But I think I've made it pretty clear that last night was the beginning, I hope, of a conversation about the budget position and all the ways that we can improve it. And I hope and expect that that will continue in the lead up, not just to the May 23 budget, but the May 24 budget as well. You know, I think the days of pretending that we don't have structural pressures on the budget are over. And as I said before, you know, part of recognising this moment that people are appreciating our willingness to talk up to people, not down to people, part of that is about being upfront about the sorts of things that the nation needs to contemplate. The nation does need to contemplate how we trim spending, how we show budget restraint, and whether we've got the best tax system that we can have fit for purpose for the challenges that we confront.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Treasurer, thanks very much for your speech. Thank you for your remark about putting a preference on the blunt over the polished, a great remark that the journalists of the room can relate to. And in that spirit, a question about energy. The budget papers show a 20% increase in electricity prices this financial year and a 20% increase in gas prices this financial year. Obviously, there is a consequence in later years, but just focused on the immediate. Is it now too late to stop that happening? Or do you actually have levers that can change those outcomes this financial year, 20% on each of those factors?
Well, I'm pleased you asked that, David, because I think one of the things that's been lost in this conversation about the first of those electricity price forecasts is that that is already flowing through. And I know that you don't want a heap of kind of partisan reflections here, but what we're seeing now in that 20% is part of what Angus Taylor hid from the Australian people during the election campaign. Some of you will recall he made quite an unusual intervention to prevent the publication of the change to the default market offer. And so this 20% that we're in right now, which is starting to show up in bills and starting to show up in figures, is actually part of that. You know, when the DMO went up, that flowed through to retail prices. And so that is already flowing. And that doesn't make it any easier for people to deal with. I'm not pretending that, but it is an important qualification. You know, the 20% this year is not from now, it's over the course of this financial year and it's already begun. And then we've got 30% next year, and in gas it goes 20 and then 20. What we've tried to say about any steps that we could take in this area is we've taken a bunch of steps, you know, in terms of funding the regulators to do their work. I really pay tribute to the ACCC, by the way, who do incredible work under Gina's leadership in this regard, and we want to involve them more in the solution than we have even in the past. So we've taken a number of important steps around energy, and Chris Bowen and Madeline King and others have done really important work. But we've got more to do. But some of these price increases are already flowing.
Are you up for putting price caps on energy?
Well, a bit like the answer to Mark's question before, you know, I don't want to here nominate a preferred path. It would require a lot of consultation with colleagues and with other levels of government, and so that's the reason why I'm not prepared to be more specific.
Sarah Martin.
Okay, given your answer to that, Treasurer, I'm going to just try pushing you a little bit more. In terms of the options available to the federal government, we already have as you mentioned with the DMO, effectively a price cap mechanism. What are the problems with how that is currently working? And if that is sort of put in place to ensure that energy retailers don't go to the wall, what more can the federal government do? Or is it really going to be up to the states to pursue reform in this area?
Well, I'm going to try and make sure that you haven't wasted your question by saying exactly what I said a moment ago, but it's in the same areas. A lot of the regulatory powers are held by the states. That's just a fact. A lot of the good work that's happened so far has been because Chris Bowen has taken a collaborative approach to working with his state counterparts in some of the other important areas, and that will be the approach that we take going forward as well. I'm not prepared to kind of elaborate on some of the mechanisms that are currently in place or the steps that we might contemplate beyond that, except to say, I was asked yesterday in the budget lock-up and through the course of the evening and through the course of the morning, and I suspect probably the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and others were as well, what additional steps could be taken. And I believe that more effective than sending people cheques to deal with it in the near term, that a better avenue for us to explore is on the regulatory side, and beyond that, I don't want to limit our options.
Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer, the petroleum resource rent tax, designed in the 80s, has proven itself to be wholly inadequate to capture some of the wealth from this great nation. In your budget, despite the ginormous prices for oil and gas, it's going to be going down to only about $2 billion. Now, that well-known socialist Rishi Sunak earlier this year increased the windfall windfall tax for oil and gas in Britain from 40% to about 65 or thereabouts. Is it about time for you to have a proper look at how much tax companies like Chevron is paying for effectively renting a resource that is owned by Australians?
Well, thanks, Andrew. First of all, the tax take in the PRRT goes up in the short term, and I do genuinely understand that a lot of people would like to see it go up more, but in the budget numbers last night there was an increase in PRRT in the near term, but you're right that it trails away after that because of the assumptions that we make about prices, but it has tracked up over the course of recent history when gas prices have been high. And the other thing to remember is that the broader company tax rate, tax take is substantially higher too, and some of the companies that we're talking about are part of that as well. You mentioned now Prime Minister Sunak, and it's an opportunity to congratulate him, of course, but also to say that I had a conversation with him when he was the Chancellor at the very beginning of our government. I had a conversation with Rishi Sunak, then Chancellor, about some of these issues, including tax, a brief conversation about it. Different countries make different decisions about how they go about this. Now, in our country, in our case, my predecessor, I think in a welcome way, and I think he did the right thing here, Josh Frydenberg, he began an inquiry into the taxation of gas, PRRT, and that work, there was some fruits of that work, and then it was paused by Treasury when they were dealing with the most intense part of COVID, and they have or are or about to or have restarted some of that work, and I'll obviously listen to the advice that I get from Treasury as they conclude that work. But it's not currently something that we're focused on. Our intention and our priority and our focus is on building on the work that Madeleine's done on supply to think about price and to think about the code of conduct in the gas market.
Thanks.
Karen Barlow.
Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times. Thank you for your address, Dr. Chalmers. The budget papers reveal a sensitive building of national significance coming in the parliamentary triangle, the National Security Office precinct. 5,000 people to be moving in not very far from here, and a price tag, I understand, with 9 zeros on it. Considering ballooning costs of construction, cost blowouts in another building across the lake, and a certain moth, the golden sun moth, how can taxpayers be assured that this unknown budget will stay in budget?
Well, first of all, we've got to make sure that our infrastructure keeps up with our challenges, and that's why we need to make sure that we've got world-class facilities for our national security agencies. Obviously, we're aware of the history of some of these big projects, and it's not talking out of school to say that the focus that Katie and I have brought to some of these discussions and some of the other colleagues is to make sure that we get value for money and that we've got a proper handle on the costs. But beyond that, it's a really important investment that I support. We need to do this for all of the right reasons, and we will, and we'll try and deliver it as efficiently as we can.
Andrew Clennell.
Mr Treasurer, Andrew Clennell from Sky News. It's been put to me that the Australian energy retailer has warned governments that in the default market offer next year, prices could rise as much as 50%. So what I'm talking about is a 70 to 80% rise, if you include the 20%, that your budget may have underestimated next year's rise by 20%. Given that, wouldn't that have more of an effect on inflation than, say, a rebate to offset that, given all the price points power bills go through? And isn't it too late for a cap because of the contracts that have already been signed around electricity?
First of all, I haven't seen that AER number, but I think it is worth remembering that the numbers that Treasury put in yesterday's budget around anticipated increases in prices for electricity were a national average. And so it is conceivable that in some parts of the market it's less than that, some parts of the market it's more than that, but I'm not familiar with that particular number. I don't think I've been briefed on that number. But the numbers as they are in the budget are confronting enough. And your point about whether the horse has bolted, a bit like the answer to an earlier question, I think David's question, is that some of these price rises are already flowing. And you know, we've made no secret of that. Part of that was the consequence of what was hidden during the election campaign. So we'll do what we can for all of the reasons I've described in all of the other questions about this. If there's more that can be done, more will be done. We don't want to limit our options. We want to do the right thing, the right and responsible and sensible thing in the context of price rises in electricity, which you know, are confronting to say the least.
Katina Curtis.
Katina Curtis from the West Australian. In the difficult discussion that we're going to have over the next 6 or 18 months, are we back in that situation of everything being on the table that we were in perhaps 5 or 6 years ago? And harking back to that time, would you contemplate, for example, broadening the base and lifting the rate of the GST, perhaps in exchange for the states doing more on the NDIS to ease the federal pressures?
Oh, no, that's not our inclination. And from time to time that gets put to us and we listen to that respectfully. Occasionally that view gets put by one or another state, depending on who the Premier of the time is. And over the 20 or so years I've been knocking around this building, from time to time people make that proposal. We listen respectfully, but it's not a path that we intend to go down. As you know, and as you allude to in your question, if you increase the GST, every cent would go to the states. And I know that's what you're getting at with the kind of a trade-off with disabilities. But quite often, not in your question, but quite often more broadly, when people put this to us, they've got so many different destinations for an increase in GST that it gets spent 4 or 5 times over. Budget repair, more money for the states and other destinations for it. So We're worried about the distributional impacts of increasing the GST. That's why we haven't been in the cart. But again, there are advocates for that. We listen to them, but it's not our intention.
Could I just clarify, Treasurer, you're not inclined to increase the rate of the GST, but what about broadening the base?
No, same answer.
Charles Croucher.
Hi, Treasurer. Charles Croucher from Channel 9. About 40 minutes ago, you said you're going to have a serious go of being as upfront as you can be with Australians. Given that, and given there's probably a one-word answer to this question, should Australians still expect that $275 off their power bills, particularly off pre-election prices?
Yep, it's in the budget.
There's about 4 words.
Laura's pointing out I was 400% over.
Poppy Johnson.
Sure, Poppy Johnston from AAP. So the Housing Accord sets up the architecture to ease housing shortages in the long term, but do you think people also need some immediate relief to housing stress they're feeling right now?
Well, as you know, Poppy, from yesterday and from other times that I've raised this, I think the Housing Accord is really important because we've got incredibly low vacancy rates, high rents, and people can't live near where the jobs and opportunities are being created. So that's what's motivated Julie and I as we've finalised this policy, working with investors, builders, and state and territory governments and local governments. You're right that it takes a little while before it comes in, 2024, but that's deliberate too, because we've got labour shortages in the industry, we've got inflation when it comes to building materials, and there's an existing pipeline of work. And one of the benefits of working so closely with the building and construction sector is because you understand the shape of that pipeline, and so we want to start in 2024 when that pipeline is expected to trail away a little bit. Now, your question about what do we do in the interim. I think one of the most important things in the budget, not that I'm taking credit for it as a new decision in the budget, but there's a $33 billion increase in the budget when it comes to payments and pensions as a consequence largely of indexation. And so payments like when it comes to rental assistance and other kinds of payments, people on fixed incomes, they get indexed, and when inflation is high, the indexation is relatively high. I know people would like more than that, I understand that genuinely, but that's an important part of the way that the budget works, and that's how the budget's working right now. It's kicking in extra for people who are on some of these payments. And when it comes to working people, one of the reasons why I'm so proud that Tony and I, first order of business for the Albanese Cabinet, was our support for a decent minimum wage rise. That was the first thing that Anthony's Cabinet decided, and I took that through with Tony, first order of business. And that's important too, because we want wages to keep up to the extent that they can. And for people who are on low and fixed incomes, those two things working together, indexation and a minimum wage increase, we hope, makes it a little bit easier. Not easy enough, but a little bit easier.
Amanda Cobb.
Hello, Treasurer. Amanda Kopp from the Community Radio Network. The Nationals have accused this budget of leaving regional Australia behind. Are they right? And the bulk of your budget commitments for regional Australia focus on infrastructure programs. I'm thinking roads, renewable projects. But how are you delivering better services for regional areas? I'm thinking specifically about access to doctors, healthcare and childcare programs as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked, Amanda, because this line that the Nationals are running is complete rubbish. There is a huge amount of investment in regional communities, and a massive amount. 700 and something different investments in the regions, including across some of the areas that you identify, but projects as well. And all we've done in the budget is we've introduced a level of rigour and robustness to spending in regional communities. As a Queenslander who knocks around regional Queensland a lot with my colleagues from the Senate and with others, I know how important regional infrastructure is and regional services are. It's ingrained on my brain, and that's why this line that's being run that somehow we've gone after the regions in this budget is rubbish. There's a lot of investment in the regions, projects and services, both sides of that equation. But what we've tried to do is we've tried to work out where Barnaby Joyce has been travelling around writing comments on the back of coasters, or issuing press releases, we've tried to say, okay, well, is there a business case for this? Is there a level of rigour? And where there isn't, we might have delayed some spending. And I think that's the right and responsible way to go about it. And the other thing I'd say about it is this, and it's not just in this area, but really right across the board. We are engaged with local governments and with state governments about how the federal government plays an active role in delivering projects and services in regional communities. And the October budget that we released yesterday had some necessary tidying up of some of those programs, long overdue, but it doesn't mean that there won't be new investments in regions in subsequent budgets as well, and that's important too.
Thank you.
Pablo Vinales.
Thank you, Treasurer. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News. A key mantra of the election was no one held back and no one left behind. Can you say to the Australian people, given the massive cost of living pressures they're facing, which you've admitted can't all be addressed, that this budget does just that?
Yeah, absolutely, because the most damaging thing for people on low and fixed incomes, the worst thing that could happen to people who are at risk of being left behind in this country is if we let inflation get out of control. Inflation inflicts a hammer blow on Australians, but particularly vulnerable Australians. And why everything I ran through in my speech is so critically important to this is because we can provide cost of living relief, we've got the indexation, we've got the minimum wage increase, all of these things are important. But the most important thing is we don't add to this inflation problem because inflation punishes the most vulnerable the most. And it helps, but you don't need to be a Labor person to recognise that. I recognise that. So we're not going to leave people behind to fend for themselves against this inflation threat which stalks our economy. It is public enemy number one. It's our highest priority to deal with it. It's going to get worse before it gets better, but it will get better. And what we've done in the budget is not add to the problem. And when it comes to not holding people back, we've got this incredibly aspirational agenda around skills and training and in so many different ways. Because while we deal with these near-term inflationary pressures, we can't forget the reason why we're here in the first place, which is to create more opportunities for more people in more parts of Australia, and the budget does that too.
We're conscious that you've got to get to question time soon, Treasurer.
I'd rather hang out with all of you, but I don't think I have the choice.
We're much more fun, but yes, our question time is more fun than theirs. But Julie Hare will ask you our last question today.
Hi.
Thank you, Mr Chalmers. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. I'd like to speak to you about the robust and very buoyant jobs market. There are 20,000 new university places in the budget and 180,000 new free TAFE places. There is an established counter-cyclical trend in that the more buoyant the jobs market, the less likely people are to go to university or to TAFE. So I'm just wondering if there's going to be an oversupply of education and training places and where these people are going to come from, especially to fill places for childcare, which you're going to need by next July.
I wouldn't have thought there'd be an oversupply of training. One of the big conclusions from the Jobs and Skills Summit we had here is that we haven't trained enough people for some of these opportunities. The opportunities are obvious. They're overwhelmingly into the future. They're in areas like the care economy, as you rightly identify in your question. We need to train more people. But what we've also tried to do, and I think Claire O'Neill's work in her migration review, working with Andrew Giles and others, is important here too, is sometimes we think in this place that if you've got labour and skills shortages, you've got to choose between training or migration or childcare and participation or some other thing. The reality is the situation for employers trying to find workers is so substantially challenging that we have to find a way to act on all of those fronts simultaneously. One of the reasons I'm so proud of our early childhood education changes, the biggest on-budget investment in the budget, is because it's cost of living relief, but also because too often in this conversation about how we fill skills shortages, we ignore new parents and particularly new mums. So paid parental leave and early childhood education are important there. Claire O'Neill's work on migration is incredibly important, and we took some steps in the budget, including trying to clear that visa backlog. but we need to train more people, and we need to make sure that the people we train are relevant to the opportunities that the economy is creating.
Please join me in thanking the Treasurer.
Thanks, Laura.